There was heavy security as Michael Adebolajo arrived to face charges of killing drummer Lee Rigby.
At the same time, the Prime Minister announces a new strategy to counter extremism in Britain.
We have to ask some tough questions about what is happening in our country.
Also on the programme, a big political row tonight over Cameron's plans to tackle the lobbying scandal.
Traitor or whistleblowing hero, how the trial of a US soldier divides America.
And the special one says, I do, in a rematch made in Chelsea.
I think we are ready to marry again and to be happy and successful again.
This is ITV News at 10 with Mark Austin and Julie Etchingham.
Good evening. The Prime Minister set out plans today to tackle extremism in Britain. He says he wants to dismantle what he called the conveyor belt to radicalisation that he said poisons the mind of some young people born here. Mr Cameron said tough questions needed to be asked about what is happening in our schools, colleges, prisons and on the internet. He was speaking as one of the men accused of murdering drummer Lee Rigby made his first court appearance, one arm in a bandage, the Quran under the other. Our UK editor Lucy Manning was there.
In central London, the police had guns at the ready. Roads were blocked. Security was high. It was the first court appearance of Michael Adebolajo, and the 28-year-old Woolwich suspect sped into court in an armoured police van. The last time the public saw Michael Adebolajo was on the day of the attack as he was filmed by onlookers. Today, dressed in white, his left arm heavily bandaged and carrying the Quran, he told the court he wanted to be known as Mujahid Abu Hamza. It means one who fights or struggles. Asked to stand, he replied, "May I ask why?" When the magistrate told him it was customary, he said, "I want to sit." He had entered the dock blowing kisses and gesturing to a supporter in the public gallery. The 4 charges were read out to Michael Adebolajo: that he'd murdered Lee Rigby, that he'd attempted to murder 2 police officers and that he'd been in possession of a firearm. He told the court he wasn't sure he'd heard those specific charges. The magistrate told him that he didn't actually need to respond at this stage. As he left court, he raised his arm, saying, "I'd like to alleviate the pain if I may," and kissed the Quran. Appearing at a different court today via video link, the other suspect, Michael Adebolajo. It's likely both men will appear in court together at the end of June. As the legal process moves on, the political response takes shape. Ministers meeting for a new monthly task force to tackle radicalisation. The Prime Minister told the Commons the murder of Lee Rigby showed that while there was nothing in Islam to justify acts of terror, poisonous ideology had to be confronted.
It was too a betrayal of Islam and of the Muslim communities who give so much to our country. It is as if, for some young people, there is a conveyor belt to radicalisation that has poisoned their minds with sick and perverted ideas. We need to dismantle this process at every stage. In schools, colleges, universities, on the internet, in our prisons, wherever it is taking place.
After the sirens blared, the Prime Minister warned tough questions had to be asked about what was happening in our country.
So Lucy, tell us more about this task force and what it will do.
Well, the Prime Minister's promising an across-the-board look at what is taking British people into extremism. So what they'll do is look at things like the charity law. Is that encouraging extremist groups? Websites, can anything be done to stop extremist websites and radicalisation in prison and universities? Ministers will be given specific areas to look at, but we haven't got any concrete proposals at the moment. There is a strategy in place at the moment. It is called the Prevent Strategy, but it gives money to various groups in the community. But it has been criticised for some of the groups that it gives money to and criticised within the Muslim community itself. The real hot political potato, though, is the Data Communications Bill, known to its critics as the Snoopers Charter. And the Prime Minister clear today that the police and the security service need access to information from the internet, people using that to make calls rather than just mobile phones. And he was clear today that if that doesn't happen and the Lib Dems haven't wanted to back it, that will make the country suffer if the police and security service don't get that access.
All right, Lucy, thank you very much indeed.
A political row is brewing at Westminster because of plans to include trade union donations to the Labour Party in a review of political lobbying. The lobbying bill will be brought forward after allegations of rule bending in the last few days and published before Parliament's summer break. Our deputy political editor, Chris Shipp, has more details.
It's a world few people understand and a big part of the reason why the lobbying industry is held in such low regard. In the rooms of the Palace of Westminster and in the hotels and bars nearby, the business of influencing politicians and policymakers goes on every day.
The events of the last few days have shown that the reputation of lobbying is in the gutter.
This man was voted Britain's top lobbyist last year, but he knows his industry has a problem with its reputation, and that has not been helped by the claims of recent days.
I don't know any reputable, with the emphasis on that word, lobbyist, who would ever offer a Member of Parliament money for them to perform services as a legislator. In my world, it doesn't operate like that. The story of the last few days is not the lobbying that I know, and I'm fed up with it because it gives a really bad reputation.
The coalition agreement in 2010 promised a legal register of all lobbyists. 3 years later, no register. Well, at least there wasn't one when the Deputy Prime Minister spoke this morning.
Well, it's taken some time. We put it in the coalition agreement, and the reason that it has taken some time to sort this out is to make sure that we get the details right, to cross the T's, to dot the I's.
But the T's were crossed and I's dotted at breakneck speed today because by this afternoon the government announced a lobbying bill by the summer to create a new register of lobbyists. But there were two surprise measures. Firstly, requiring trade unions to carry out annual audits of membership numbers, and secondly, by clamping down on union contributions in election campaigns.
Well, we think this is a cheap, cynical effort by the government to use the lobbying scandal of the last few days to really take another dig at the 6.5 million people who are trade union members in this country. Trade unions, where they're involved in the political process, all of that funding is open, is honest.
The surprise measures in the surprise bill was condemned by the unions and the Labour Party they financially support. Ed Miliband's office called it a shabby and panicked attempt to divert attention. This is now a highly politicised piece of legislation. There were receptions on the terraces of the Commons tonight and perhaps some lobbying too. But David Cameron hopes his move to stop lobbying becoming the next political scandal he once predicted it would be. Chris Shipp, ITV News, Westminster.
Now, aiming to show that Labour is ready to deal with the deficit, the Shadow Chancellor Ed Balls has got pensioners paying top-rate tax in his sights.
He wants to take away a universal benefit, their winter fuel payments, though not, apparently, their free bus travel and TV licences. Our political editor, Tom Bradby, reports.
The Labour Party was trying to address a simple question today. Will we trust them with our money again? Like all politicians, Ed Balls has a habit of repeating himself a lot, just to make sure we don't miss the point.
We'll need to show an iron discipline on spending control.
Have you got it yet? Yes. The message is Labour is toughening up on the public finances, a move which could include, for example, cancelling winter fuel payments for the better off.
The situation we will inherit will require a very different kind of Labour government to those which have gone before. At a time when public services that pensioners and others rely on are under strain, it can no longer be a priority to pay the winter allowance to the wealthiest pensioners.
This would in fact result in pretty insignificant savings, but it would end a core universal benefit. In other words, one all pensioners get, and not everyone in his party is happy about that.
I don't believe the money saved, which is tiny, almost peanuts, is worth breaching the principle that everybody contributes their taxes and everybody should benefit from what are now few universal benefits like pensioner ones left.
The government says the key question for Ed Balls is whether he will accept the next round of spending cuts it is about to propose.
Well, Labour's plan is for even more borrowing, more debt and more spending. That's the only plan they have. And any of the tough decisions that need to be taken to bring borrowing under control, they've still got their heads stuck in the sand and they're not willing to confront any of those issues.
Labour's leaders know that on public spending and on welfare, they have a problem with the electorate. They're attempting to address both issues this week.
So, Tom, how important is this week and this repositioning for Labour?
Well, I think what it is a significant sign that they know they have a problem in this regard. Of course, you'll remember it's historic. Labour was in charge in the run-up to the bust. We were running a deficit at the very end of the greatest boom Britain's ever seen. You might argue that perhaps we shouldn't have been running a deficit at that point. The Tories arguably would have been doing exactly the same thing because they promised to match Labour's spending totals. But what it left Labour with was a historic problem in terms of trust with the electorate on this issue. At the time, Peter Mandelson was desperately trying to get Gordon Brown to acknowledge it more. Had he been leader, David Miliband, I think, would have gone out much more on the front foot and acknowledged it as a problem and dealt with it, and so on. Part of the problem has been that Ed Balls and Ed Miliband simply believe that cutting back too much on public spending is the wrong thing economically to do, and they believe that very passionately. But that has left them with this legacy political problem, if you like, in that talking constantly about the need to keep spending worries people in terms of the public finances. So what we've seen today is Ed Balls trying to begin to address that. I wouldn't put it any higher than that, and I think we'll just have to see as the detail rolls out, as the detail is filled in, how much that really is a change.
OK, Tom, thank you.
The US Army private who provided the WikiLeaks website with nearly 750,000 military secrets finally went on trial today. Bradley Manning could end up with a life sentence. As our Washington correspondent Robert Moore reports, some Americans say he was right to expose uncomfortable military truths. Others call him a traitor.
Bradley Manning, set him free!
As his supporters rallied this weekend, America's military justice system has finally put Bradley Manning on trial. It's been over 3 years since the former Army intelligence analyst gave hundreds of thousands of classified documents to WikiLeaks, severely embarrassing the United States. His lawyer told the court-martial that Manning was young and naive, but well-intentioned, wanting to make the world a better place. During an earlier court appearance, Private Manning admitted leaking information, and for that alone he faces 20 years in prison. But prosecutors are levelling still graver charges against him.
By far the most controversial move by military prosecutors is to charge Bradley Manning with aiding the enemy. In other words, to claim that he knowingly gave secrets to Al-Qaeda. His supporters say instead he should be celebrated as a whistleblower.
Come on, fire!
The best known of Manning's leaks was this video of seemingly cavalier US helicopter pilots firing on suspected insurgents in Baghdad.
Oh yeah, look at that, right through the windshield.
But they mistook TV cameras for weapons and killed instead civilians and a Reuters news crew.
That Bradley was an extraordinary American.
Among those publicly defending Bradley Manning is America's most famous whistleblower, Daniel Ellsberg, who leaked the Pentagon Papers in 1971 that exposed America's deception over Vietnam.
They'll be called traitor. He may go into life in prison for it. But actually, I think he deserves to be recognized from now on as a great American patriot and a great human being.
P.J. Crowley, the former spokesman for Hillary Clinton, has been sharply critical of Manning's treatment, but says not all information can be released.
If that's the case, we cease to be able to resolve global problems through conversations and interactions among government that, by their definition, need to be confidential.
Manning's leaks were the most extensive in history, providing a remarkable insight into the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, but also, according to US officials, undermining national security and almost certainly costing lives. Robert Moore, ITV News, at Fort Meade in Maryland.
The Duke of Edinburgh, described as under the weather by Buckingham Palace, was not at the Queen's side this evening at a gala reception. Tomorrow is the big service at Westminster Abbey to celebrate the 60th anniversary of her coronation. Our royal correspondent, Tim Hewitt, is at the palace. Tim, what are they saying there tonight?
Well, they say the Duke will be at the Abbey. It's a huge occasion for the royal family. All the senior members of the royal family will be there, and it's clearly an occasion that he does not want to miss. He'll be leaving Buckingham Palace with the Queen in the morning for the short drive to the Abbey. Now, the Queen went alone tonight to a gala event organised by the Royal National Institute for the Blind at St James's Palace, just across the way here. The Duke of Edinburgh should have gone, he didn't, and it was then that questions were asked about his health. The response from the palace was, as you say, that he's under the weather. but he's not in hospital. Nevertheless, the Duke turns 92 next week. He's been in hospital 3 times in the last 19 months, and any concern about his health is always taken rather seriously.
Absolutely. Tim, thank you very much indeed.
Well, later in the programme, we'll have a first look at some of tomorrow's front pages. Plus, Oscar Pistorius due back in court tomorrow. We talk to his coach about how he's dealing with the pressures of facing a murder trial.
Oscar said to us once that the mornings and the evenings is still not good.
And a century on from one of the defining acts of the suffragettes campaign, we ask how far feminism has come. First, the much-hyped Funding for Lending scheme has done little to get banks lending more to business. In fact, new figures showed the amount actually fell last month. Well, our business editor Laura Koonsberg is here. So, disappointing figures, Laura.
Well, a year ago, when the Chancellor and the Bank of England launched this, they talked of emergency firepower, making up to £80 billion worth of cheap loans available to the banks to then get them out to businesses that were struggling to get the cash they need for new equipment, to hire more staff and to get the economy gunning along again. But figures show that instead of the heavy ammunition, it's been a bit more like a pop gun. The banks have taken up £16.5 billion. And instead of that getting out the door from the bank manager to business, the balance of lending has actually fallen, and fallen most recently by £300 million. Now, in part, that's because the banks are understandably still quite focused on trying to fix the mess that went before. But it's also because the banks and businesses are still wary. They're still risk averse because the economic climate is still really tough. More broadly, it tells us that funding for lending, which was launched with huge fanfare, has not been a game changer so far. And it also, as a barometer, illustrates the economy is far from fixed. And like it or not, it's difficult for the economy that matters for us all to really get back to something approaching normal if that critical relationship between the banks and business is still not working as it should.
OK, Laura, thank you very much.
Survivors of a huge fire in a chicken processing factory in China have described the chaos and the panic as they struggled to escape. 120 others did not. All but one of the exits were locked. People were trampled in the dark after the lights went out. Our China correspondent Angus Walker reports.
The fire broke out just before dawn and spread quickly. More than 300 workers had already started their shift at a chicken processing factory in northeast China. Eyewitnesses say they heard explosions and then the building rapidly filled with smoke. Disturbing accounts are emerging of a chaotic scramble to escape, of victims trapped in narrow corridors leading to locked exits. This injured woman told reporters from State TV that people fell over and were trampled in the panic. She says she crawled out. Another worker says she tried to get to a door but was forced back by the flames. This is the factory before the fire, a huge plant spread over many acres. Staff have claimed doors were routinely locked. Fire drills never practiced. There's growing public outrage, questioning of the factory's safety standards as an investigation begins. At this early stage, it's believed an ammonia leak may have caused the disaster. This is certainly one of the worst factory fires in China's history, a country where industrial accidents are tragically common. The high death toll and the shocking stories from survivors are putting pressure on central government here in Beijing, and already China's leaders are publicly calling for factory managers to face justice if the safety of workers was put at risk. Angus Walker, ITV News, Beijing. The coach who has helped make Oscar Pistorius the most famous Paralympic athlete in the world has given ITV News an insight into his state of mind in the run-up to his latest court appearance.
Ampi Lau says Pistorius is struggling. He's charged with murdering his girlfriend, Riva Steenkamp. Tomorrow he'll appear at a pre-trial hearing. Our Africa correspondent Rohit Khatri reports.
Oscar, I love to say he's fine, but he's not fine.
Oscar Pistorius' coach recalls a romance between his protege and his new girlfriend.
Between all sessions, Oscar will go to give a hug or lie on her lap. And that's the relationship I saw.
Umpi Lau helped to create an icon, an Olympic superstar. And since Oscar Pistorius was granted bail in February, few have remained as close as the man who coached him for 10 years. He says his role now is to coach him through his grief. He's accused of the premeditated murder of girlfriend Riva Steenkamp.
Oscar said to us once that the mornings and the evenings is still not good.
But during the day, he's doing some training, he's reading the Bible.
Yeah, he's busy. Then the pastor come and see him, then friends come and see him. If he phones me in October, listen, coach, I want to go to the track, we go. But I've said that I don't see him competing this year.
Oscar Pistorius will return here to the court tomorrow for a brief hearing that will be a big step towards a trial next year. And prosecutors have already drawn up a list of witnesses that they want to call. Springbok rugby star Francois Hogard features on the list seen tonight by ITV News. He was a close friend of Miss Steenkamp. Mark Batchelor, the former South African footballer, features too. He claims to have had a fight with Pistorius. And security staff from Pistorius' estate in Pretoria may also be called. Tomorrow, the Olympian who for months has hidden from the spotlight will see its glare again. His murder trial is now months away. Rohit Kachru, ITV News, Pretoria.
Jose Mourinho is back where he says he belongs, in charge at Chelsea. It ended in tears last time, 6 years ago, when he fell out with the club's owner, Roman Abramovich. Now he says he and Chelsea are ready to marry again. Our sports editor Steve Scott looks at how it might be different this time.
This was no fond farewell. Mourinho left division, not contentment in his wake at Real Madrid. Several players were openly scathing about his reign, making his reunion with Chelsea owner Roman Abramovich an easy decision.
I asked the boss, do you want me back? And the boss asked me, do you want to come back? And I think in a couple of minutes, decision made. In my case, it's not about winning, it's about moving to a place I love, and happiness is much more stronger than tiredness. So I'm so happy to be back. I'm ready to do it. I don't need holidays.
First time round at Chelsea, Jose Mourinho won 2 Premier League titles, 1 FA Cup, 2 League Cups and 1 Community Shield. The only silverware he couldn't bring back to London was a Champions League trophy. Mourinho thrives on conflict, and while his antics irritated many, Chelsea fans always remembered him with affection, not just for his success, but his love of the limelight too.
I'm European champion, so I'm not one of the bottle. I think I'm a special one. In the supermarket you have eggs class 1, class 2, class 3. And some are more expensive than others, and some give you better omelets.
But like rekindling an old romance that turned sour, is there more risk of failure the second time around?
I think we are ready to marry again and to be happy and successful again.
If you're going to minimise the risk, what you try and do is you get somebody who's genuinely successful. And if you look through world football, I think there's 2 people that come close to guaranteeing success. One of them was Sir Alex Ferguson. I would suggest the other one's Mourinho. So, yes, it's a risk going back, but it's a very limited risk.
And it's a risk Chelsea fans have been crying out for, almost since the moment he first left.
So, Steve, will this be a second marriage made in heaven, do you think?
The honest answer, Julie, is I don't know, and nor does anybody else. But could it work? Well, yes, of course it could. I mean, there aren't many managers at the top level who've fallen out with their club, returned to it and made a success of it. There is one recent precedent, though. Jupp Heynckes from Bayern Munich. He was sacked by them in the early 90s, returned a couple of years ago for his 3rd spell in charge, and of course a few weeks ago went on to lift the Champions League trophy. At Chelsea, of course, Mourinho is going to get a very warm welcome, and although they might not admit it publicly, I reckon football fans everywhere will be relishing his return, and that's because of his unpredictability. You know that with Jose Mourinho in the Premier League, life is never going to be dull.
I know somebody in here who might be too. OK, thank you very much indeed, Steve.
No, we're all happy he's back, including Julie. Now, on tomorrow's front pages, the Mirror quotes David Cameron's call to end extremist hate in schools and on the internet. The Telegraph quotes the Dragon's Den businessman James Caan as saying that parents should not help their children to get a job. Mr. Caan says they should be allowed to struggle and to learn from their mistakes. And the Daily Mail reports a warning from a committee of MPs that families should stop eating meat on a daily basis to prevent food shortages. It shows Prince Philip and reports what it calls his new health scare.
And finally, tomorrow marks the 100th anniversary of that pivotal moment in the history of feminism when a suffragette threw herself in front of the King's horse during the Epsom Derby. It was 5 years later that voting by women was allowed. But how far has feminism advanced in the century since? Our social affairs editor, Penny Marshall, has this assessment.
Oh my goodness.
For the descendants of Emily Davison, her legacy is personal.
Is that her purse?
But her archive, the items she died holding, are a national reminder of the progress women have made, as well as a record of her sacrifice.
We take for granted so much today, and I think it's very important to realise that this fight went on for nearly 100 years before women got the vote. We need to make this generation aware of what they've got and that they must use it.
It was a century ago that Emily Davison was knocked down by the King's horse at Epsom Derby. The militant campaigner died of her injuries 4 days later. It was another 15 years before all women got the vote. At first, the suffragettes had been vilified and outcast, but soon thousands of women were marching for the cause. Winning the right to vote was the achievement of a mass movement which still resonates today.
100 years later, and the suffragettes may no longer be packing the streets around Westminster, but the movement they started is now being embraced by a new generation of feminists.
This new wave of radical young women say the work the suffragettes began is not yet done.
I think there is a growing sense that the feminist revolution is incomplete, that it isn't over, and that gender is deeply political. And what I find deeply inspiring right now is the amount of very young women in their, even in their early teens, who are starting campaigns, reading and blogging and finding out more information about how to make the world better.
And the global struggle for equality women face is now a popular cause.
It's unbelievable to me that there are places in the world where there is no justice and where we're not treated equally and where we can't use our voice.
Emily Davison lost her life 100 years ago fighting for equality. Honouring her sacrifice today gives women of the past and the present a voice. Penny Marshall, ITV News.
And that is tonight's ITV News at 10.
The national weather is coming up next, and the news from your part of the UK. But from the two of us, good night and thank you for watching.
Good night.